Was that a now guy? I didn't talk to him.
J.H. Pagel.
That's what I was saying before it interrupted. Yeah, when I first met John and really got to talk to him, I was at a bowling and pizza party. And his kids were running around, and he was like, yeah, my life's crazy, but here's some high-beef pizza. Would you want to take it home? Because I don't want to take it home. And then that fostered into more conversation, obviously. And it's just been a real pleasure to get to know John, and I know he has a lot of cool things to share. So give it up for DJ Pagel.
Quite the intro. Thanks, Griffin. I'm going to do a little change up tonight. So I'm going to use the whiteboard.
What?
I know, exciting.
Sorcery.
And we're going to time this so I have an idea of where we're at. Like Griffin said, my name is Jon Pagel, and I'm the campus director for the Navigators here. And I'm really excited to be with you. And if I haven't met you, please introduce yourself to me afterwards. I'd love to get to know you some. The Navs are here to know Christ and make Him known and help others do the same. And my wife and I have been doing ministry with college students for 8 years, and I still feel as convinced as ever that college ministry is like one of the most strategic places to do ministry with your guys' season of life and the time that you have. And so I'm excited to be here on campus and with you guys tonight. Let's see. I get to open up our series called Purpose, what it means to bear God's image. And tonight we're going to look at the story of the Bible that's going to kind of provide the soil for us to talk about the next 4 weeks. And next week, Rich is going to talk about work and what that means for us as image bearers. We're going to talk about justice. Micah and David together are going to talk about that after spring break. And then we're going to talk about sexuality. And then we're going to talk about money. How do we be good stewards as God's image bearers of what He's given to us? And really easy, light topics that few people have any opinions about, right? So it's going to be great. I'm actually really, really excited about this. And I'm excited to talk about this in particular with you guys tonight. And I think people have a lot of things they go to the Bible for. They might go to the Bible to see examples of heroes that they want to emulate. People they want to be more like. They might go to the Bible because it's a book of commands that's going to teach them how to live the right way. They might go to the Bible because it talks about different topics that are relevant to them, about parenthood, or how do I be a good son or daughter, or relationships. And the Bible has lots to say about these things, and we should look at what it says for sure. But I think that the primary thing that the Bible is trying to do for us is not just to be a guidebook to look at different topics or to just give us rules to live by, but it's showing and writing for us a story about who God is, about why He's created our world and what He's doing in our world, why He's created us and what we're supposed to be doing in light of who He is. And so we're going to be talking about that tonight, and we're going to be looking at verses in the Bible. So get your Bibles ready, get your phone ready, and this is going to be fun and exciting. You guys are going to, I've already asked some of you guys to read some verses for us. So that's fun. And if you want to take a picture of this, if you want to write down notes, whatever is going to help you kind of track along with this story. My Bible's kind of small, and it's about 1,000 pages, and we're going to cover it in 30 minutes. So let's get ready. Some of us have varying degrees of familiarity with the Scriptures, and one of the things that I've been praying for tonight is that we would feel maybe a little bit more unfamiliar with the Bible, because some of us have grown up hearing a lot of the stories, and we kind of think we know most of what's in there. And I feel like the more I read the Bible and learn about what's in there, the more I'm realizing, like, I don't know. And the more I'm realizing, like, how amazing God is. And I hope that this drives us towards curiosity and excitement to enter into the story and learn more about who God is. And that disrupts maybe some of our familiarity with the Scriptures. So here we are. The first part of our story is creation. creation. And who has Genesis 1:1? Shortest verse.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
The Bible is a story about the union of heaven and earth. And there's a couple of things that have really helped me kind of understand some of the Bible in this way. One is a Bible Project video called Heaven and Earth. It's about 5 minutes, and it's awesome. There's also a Tim Mackey message called Compelled, and that's like maybe 45 minutes or so on YouTube. And then just also lots of other things, but I feel like those are two of my primary sources that will really help me understand this. The Bible is a story about God uniting heaven and earth. And so in Genesis 1, we see that God is creating all things and that he's bringing order out of chaos. And over again, we see that what he's doing is it's good. And one of the things that God creates is people, Adam and Eve. And he gives them a unique role. And can someone read Genesis 1:26 through 28? So dramatic.
Genesis 1:26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created a man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth."
Awesome, thanks. This is a verse that you want to come back to like regularly, because this really sets a lot of the tone for the story, because this is the role that God's given humanity, to bear his image. And there's this amazing space that God creates called the Garden of Eden. And for the sake of clarity, like heaven is like the dark circle, and then the dotted circle is like earth. And this is where heaven and earth are overlapping, where God's space and human space come together. And this is what you see the Garden of Eden is in Genesis 1 and 2. God creates, and Adam and Eve dwell with God in the garden. And they're given this job to rule over the earth in creation, to take the flourishing abundance of the garden and bring it to the rest of the world. But they're to do this as they trust God's wisdom, and as they rule, and as they partner with him, and they're his representation in the world. And to rule and to do any of this is going to take lots of wisdom. There's going to lots of decisions that will be made. And they're to do this as they trust God. And so to be an image bearer is to create, to build, and to rule in God's wisdom. That's also for the good of humanity and for the good of the world. And I think this is really important. So remember Genesis 1:26 to 28, because that's going to come up again later. And I think just for the sake of clarifying too, like we see in Genesis 1 and 2 a God that is powerful, that is wise, he's generous, he's blessing humanity and giving them all these amazing resources and this opportunity, and that he's really, really good. These are the qualities I think that we see coming out of who God is. And so, will Adam and Eve, will humanity rule in God's wisdom, or are they going to rule in their own? And so we're going to move on now to the second part of the story, and we'll just call this the fall. And someone has Genesis 3:1 through 7. You want to read that out loud for us, Nick?
Yeah. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden." But God said, "Neither shall you touch it, lest you die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired, to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths.
The serpent has, how many sentences did he have? 3 sentences. I counted 43 words is all it takes. And humanity is urged not to trust God and his wisdom, and instead to seize autonomy and independence for themselves and to rule in separation from God. And it's, in essence, to redefine good and evil based on what benefits them instead of what's good for the world around them. And it's interesting, like, and ironic that they want to be like God, the serpent says. It's like they're created in God's image. They're already like God. And yet this is enticing to them, and so they eat of the fruit. And they're banished out of the garden. And so now we have 2 separate spaces where humanity can no longer dwell with God. God's space and human space are separate. But as they're kicked out of the garden into the wilderness in the end of chapter 3, there's hope. And so who has Genesis 3:15?
I do.
Okay.
Something more dramatic than that. Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
So this verse sets up some of the plot conflict for the rest of the Bible, because there's this offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman. And the offspring of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent, but the serpent is also going to bruise his heel. And so the question is, like, who is the offspring of the woman? Like, who is this going to be? And you read the rest of Genesis with this kind of expectation of who this character is going to be. But what you see after Genesis 3 is person after person giving into the influence of the serpent. And like Adam and Eve, they distrust God. What he says is best for them, they eat of the fruit. And they're giving into the influence of the serpent. And so Genesis 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 is like this big spiral down. It's like this big spiral down into disaster. You see Cain and Abel. There's a portrait of the flood. There's a guy named Lamech who's killing people and bragging about it. And it culminates in Genesis 11, 3 through 4. So who's got that verse for us? Logan.
And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth."
Awesome. So in Genesis 11, it's the Tower of Babel, and there's this group of people that want to come together. They don't want to multiply across the face of the earth, right? Isn't that what God told them in Genesis 1? Well, what do they want to do? They don't want to spread across the earth. They want to stay in one place. And they don't want to make a name for God. They want to make a name for themselves, don't they? And so the Tower of Babel and the city of Babylon is really like, is all these people's choices to continue redefine good and evil, and it culminates into this place. And God comes down, and he disperses them and confuses their language. And we wonder now, like, what is God going to do about this? Like, this, God wants to rule his world through people as they're trusting his wisdom. And time again, like, this is not what we're seeing people doing. And more than that, too, like, who's the seed of the woman that's going to crush the serpent? So we stand back and ask these kind of questions, and we also see just the effects of sin in our world. It's really like an undoing of creation. If God's bringing order out of chaos in Genesis 1, sin is bringing about more and more chaos and destruction in the world. You could also say, like, sin is just like, it's like self-sabotage. It's like stupid, it's foolish. Are you guys familiar with The Lord of the Flies? I kind of think about it as like, my kids don't want to listen and obey me in our home, even though I'm trying to provide like a good home for them to have fun. We're providing meals for them. we're going out to and having like one-on-one time together. They have a comfortable bed. There's order and structure in our home. And there's times where they really need to listen and obey, and there's times for discipline. But it's really good for them, and it's a thriving place. And it's like, I don't want to listen to your rules. I want to go out to this island, and I want to go to the Lord of the Flies, where it's just like destruction and chaos, and whoever can be the strongest and assert their voice will win. And this is kind of like what sin is. It's self-destruction, and it's undoing creation, and it's dehumanizing to us. As people who are made in God's image, sin uses other people, other image bearers, to our own advantage. And this is just not how we're meant to live. We're not meant to live with ourselves at the center of our world, using other people for what's best for us. This is what's happening then. So what is God going to do? We move to the next part of our story, and can someone read Genesis 12, 1 through 3? Great, thanks, Anna.
Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Another very, very important verse in the Bible, a couple of verses. God chooses Abraham out of Babylon to give him a name, descendants, and land. Where else have we heard the word bless or blessing so far? Do you guys remember? You guys remember it was used in Genesis 1, 26 and 28, how he blessed them to multiply across the face of the earth. God is now giving this blessing to Abraham, and now he's the carrier of the blessing that Adam and Eve had. He's going to bring about the union of heaven and earth by knowing what it means to be in relationship with God, and that his family and his descendants then will be a light to the nations around them and to bring blessing to those people. And if you remember just the chapter before in the Tower of Babel, they wanted to make a name for themselves. And now one of the things that God promises here in Genesis 12 is that he's going to make a name for Abraham. And the very thing that these people were trying to earn for themselves, God is going to willingly give to Abraham if he will trust him by faith to do what Abraham feels like is impossible. And so Abraham's family of Israel is to learn to dwell with God in his presence. And if you read some of the Old Testament, you know that God's presence dwells amongst Israel in temples. And first it's the tabernacle, and then it's the temple that they build in Jerusalem. But this is the space where God would dwell among his people, and so this is kind of where like these two places, these two dimensions now overlap. God is dwelling with Israel, that they would know what it means to be his rescued and redeemed people, and that as they get to know who God is, that they would then be a light to the nations to bring blessing out to them. But does this work? If we read very far into the Old Testament, right after they're even rescued out of Egypt, they're already complaining. They want to go back to Egypt. They think that they had it really good. They're kind of throwing like a revolt over Moses. And you keep reading throughout the Old Testament, and you see that this isn't going to work. And what's going on, I think, is like Genesis 3 through 11 is kind of just a picture of all of Israel's history. They don't trust God. They're not ruling over creation as God has asked them to. They don't trust him. They use creation for what benefits them at the expense of others. But amongst Israel's failure, we have hope that God is still remembering what his promise is, that he's at work in the world. And we have glimmers of hope. There's people like Abraham and Moses and David, amongst others, who really trust God, and they worship him, and they obey, and they act in faith in some pretty incredible ways. They make peace with those around them. They trust God when it seems like that is ridiculous or impossible. They're praying for their enemies. And you see little pictures and portraits of what it's going to look like for someone to redeem the world and undo the curse of sin. And we also have promises foreshadowing what's going to come in the future. And so does someone have Jeremiah 31 through 34? Awesome. Thanks, Eli.
Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor, and each teach his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more.
Awesome. The law will be on their hearts. Their sins will be forgiven. Does someone have 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 17? Great.
When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him. As I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David.
Awesome. So David's about ready to pass away, and Nathan is speaking to him about his son that's going to rule on the throne after him. But some of the things in there, you get the feeling like this is more than just his son Solomon ruling. He will never pass away from the throne, and he will be to me a son, and I to him a father. There's major foreshadowing of the line of David continuing well beyond Solomon, coming to redeem and rescue the people of Israel. And last one, last promise, Isaiah 41:6. Who has that one?
I have that one.
Oh, great.
He says, It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth.
Awesome. Someone is coming who will bring salvation to the ends of the earth. That this is not just about Israel's promises being fulfilled, but salvation is going to go to the nations. And we have glimpses of who it will be. And it's after Israel comes out of captivity in Babylon. If you guys are familiar with Israel's history, they come back to Jerusalem and they rebuild the temple. Some are really excited. Some are like crying because they're so sad of how pathetic the temple is compared to what Solomon had. And shortly after that, the story kind of goes dormant for 400 years. And it goes dormant until we see in the New Testament, Jesus comes onto the scene. And he comes to be the ultimate image bearer. And in John, it says that this word wasn't just with God in the beginning. This word actually was God. And this word, actually, in John 1:14, it says the word dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The temple of Israel, this was a foreshadow of who Jesus was coming to be. And Jesus, when he came to dwell, this is temple language of God coming to dwell with humanity. And when Jesus comes to dwell with sinful people, you see him teaching, and you see him healing, and you see heaven crashing into and breaking into earth. And in the way he touches unclean people, Jesus doesn't become unclean. Sins are forgiven. The lame are walking. Dead people are rising again. There's just ridiculous things that are going on that Jesus is doing. And all these things are alluding to the fact that this is God himself in the person of Jesus who's coming down to earth. Jesus is picking up the story of Israel and he's carrying it forward. The culmination of their history and the fulfillment of their promises of God coming to rescue his people is coming in Jesus. And the good news that Jesus speaks about, we can see in Mark 1, 14 and 15. Who has that one? Caitlin.
After John had been taken into custody, Jesus came into Galilee, preaching the gospel of God, saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel."
So the good news is that God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, is crashing down into earth in the person of Jesus. And that he's just not another person that was born, but he's actually the rightful king of the universe. And he's come to assert his authority. And this is amazing. It's causing all sorts of things to go on. And he hasn't just come to deal with people who are under the influence of the serpent, but he's come to actually deal with sin at its root by defeating the serpent himself. And we see, like from Mark as well, that the kingdom of God is not just some place that you go to after you die, but it's something that has arrived in Jesus. I think that's really important for us to begin to understand. And as he's doing these things, as he's teaching and he's healing, as he's serving, as he's perfectly obeying God and loving others, he's declaring that he is God, that he is the fulfillment of Israel's promises. But he's not treated like a king that we would expect, is he? He's not lifted up onto a throne to be inaugurated as a king. He's actually lifted up onto a cross. And his crown isn't a crown of gold that would impress someone. It's actually a crown of thorns. And he's not praised and celebrated as a king. He's actually mocked and spit on in one of the most shameful ways that humans could possibly conceive of. But we know that Jesus came to be crucified and to deal with the problem of sin, but it didn't just stay with the crucifixion. It actually led to a resurrection. And 3 days later, Jesus was raised from the dead. And so we see that Jesus came to do war against the serpent and to get to the root of sin. In John 8, Jesus says that Satan was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. And Jesus came to destroy that liar and murderer on the cross. And his crucifixion and resurrection is a declaration of his hatred for sin and his hatred for mistrust and that's wreaking havoc in the world. And in a way far more like than we hate it. Like sometimes I get uncomfortable with like some of the effects of sin in the world, but Jesus comes to get to the root of sin. He doesn't just come to deal and get rid of outward effects of sin in the world, like racism or prejudice, slavery or abuse, damaged relationships, drug addiction. He comes to get rid of anger and lust and pride and contempt, selfishness and bitterness and unforgiveness. And who can't identify with some of that in our hearts? Like, who can't say that those aren't things that, if we look in and think about, don't have some of those things dwelling in our heart? And we see that then that God cannot get rid of sin in the world without getting rid of us, because we have sin in us. The problem is not just out there, are actually like creating hell on earth. I'll just put H. We're creating hell as we act and we bring about decreation, as we dehumanize one another. And I just think about just in my last few weeks about times which I've gotten upset at my kids and I've yelled at them. And like I'm bringing about decreation. I'm dehumanizing my kids. When we want something that's not ours, we could call that lust in like maybe a sexual connotation, but in all sorts of ways. When we lust for something that's not ours, it's bringing about decreation in the world. It's bringing about like hell on earth. And Jesus came to get rid of hell. This is what he came to do. He came to unite heaven and earth in his kingdom. And this brings about, I think, like a serious crossroads, because sometimes the way we talk about hell is a way that no one would obviously never want that. And some of these images of hell, like, are things that Jesus does talk about. But what about all the ways in which I choose sin in my life, day to day and week to week, and I don't give any thought towards the reality that this is bringing about like hell in my relationships. This is not what God is going to have in his kingdom. And so to come to Jesus is to see the victory of the cross, but it's also simultaneously, it's like a double-edged sword that's cutting deep inside my own heart and confronting me with like my own issues and my own sin that I want to look over. And so Jesus talks about why it's like this. It's not the healthy who need a physician, it's the sick. And so Jesus is welcoming us to come to him and to come with our broken hearts that are messed up and that are self-centered. And if we will bring those to the foot of the cross and ask for forgiveness and come in humility, he will receive us and he will bring about forgiveness in our life. But that's a hard thing, and it's easy to talk about in the world out there. But when it's just thinking about me and God and thinking about my own sin, this should be hard for us to think about, I think, because this is the things that Jesus is getting rid of in his kingdom. And so this is what Jesus came to do, but also we know that his kingdom is not fully here. We see brokenness all around us. But he came to inaugurate the kingdom, and the kingdom is not fully realized. And so we are looking ahead one day to restoration. Where hell will be removed from our world and from God's kingdom. And he's coming back. He's coming back to finish what he started, you guys. Hebrews 9:27-28. Can someone read that?
And just as it was appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting.
Yeah, he's coming back to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. The kingdom is here, and we see it in some ways, but it's not fully here. And so we're in this weird, like, in-between phase of seeing victory, but also seeing that, like, the serpent's influence still is reigning all over the place. Does someone have Revelation 21, 1-4, and verse 22?
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne, saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anywhere, for the former things have passed away. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb.
There's no more temple, and you guys catch how many times the word dwelling was used in that verse? God is dwelling with his people in harmony in the way it was originally designed to be. And as image bearers, as people who are made to reflect the God's image, we will be able to do that perfectly, I think, in the new kingdom, in the new earth. And so for those that have trusted in Jesus, that have brought their brokenness and their sinful hearts to him, there's life with God to enjoy him and others, and the new heavens and the new earth. But for those who don't, they're given ultimately what they want, life outside God's kingdom. And C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Great Divorce, has a quote that I really like. And he says that there are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. And ultimately, if we won't come to God to heal us and for his love to absorb the effects of our sin and to forgive us, he's going to give us what we ultimately want, which is life apart from him. And I think there's so much that we don't know. There's all sorts of things in the story that the Bible is not interested in telling us more about, that we're like very confused by, or we want to know more information. Time and time again, when the Bible is pointing ahead to future restoration, It's doing so to encourage people for faithfulness and perseverance and sacrificial love in the present. It's not to just give them all the answers so they know what's coming, but it's to guarantee them so that they would live with faithfulness and perseverance in the present. And I think that's what we need to know and have a guarantee that God is just. He's going to do what's right. He's going to remove evil and wickedness and sinfulness from our world. And we need to live then, knowing that, in faithfulness and love now. So I think there's a few things that it's helpful maybe to just talk about for this. One, that we need to know where we're at in the story, that restoration's coming, that we're experiencing the brokenness still of sin in our world, but there's hope in the midst of that brokenness because we know that Jesus is coming back. I think we need to know what's ahead because what we're thinking about in the future impacts directly how we live today. And I think it's sad when people who have no thought towards God or a creator have more care and thought for our world than like we as Christians do. We should have incredible care and thought like for our world. God loves our world and he wants to redeem it. And we're his image bearers here to do that. And I think we should take that really seriously. I think we should be reminding ourselves of this story often to awaken us worship and faithfulness and wonder in who God is and what he's doing. And to remind ourselves that he is at work. That the story is not over and it's not hopeless, but he's still working. I have a few questions just for us to consider. What most stood out to you about the story? Was anything new or surprising? How do you doubt God and maybe give in to the influence of the serpent in your life? And is Jesus uncomfortably getting to the root of sin in your life? And if so, how? So take a minute and think about those, or you can even talk about those with someone next to you. And we're going to close with, I think, a few songs of worship. Thanks, guys.